I must draw the House's attention to the fact that financial privilege is engaged by both the Lords' amendments. If the House agrees to either of these Lords' amendments, I shall ensure that the appropriate entry is made in the Journal. We begin with the Government's motion to disagree with Lords' Amendment 1, with which it will be convenient to consider Lords' Amendment 2. I call the Minister, Guy Opperman.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Social Security Uprating of Benefits Bill is a one-year bill by reason of the pandemic. Madam Deputy Speaker, last year, as you will be aware, we changed the law for 1 year to increase state pensions by 2.5% when average earnings had fallen and consumer price inflation increased by half a percentage point. If we had not taken this action, state pensions would have been frozen. This year, average earnings growth is estimated to be unusually high, distorted by the cumulative effects of the natural economic reactions to the coronavirus pandemic and the response to the supportive measures introduced by the government to protect livelihoods. The figures for average weekly earnings from May to July, the measure used for uprating earnings-linked benefits, has grown at 8.3%, which is over 2 percentage points higher than at any time over the last 2 decades. Recognising this COVID-related distortion, the government is setting aside the earnings link for 1 more year, 2022 to 2023, and continuing the double lock of at least inflation or 2.5%. The triple lock will be applied again in the usual way for the basic and new state pensions from the following year. I will give way, yes, of course.
For giving way, and of course I understand why the government has decided not to increase the state pension by 8%, but can you tell the House, is it still the government's intention that the value of the state pension should, over time, at least keep track with earnings?
Well, the honourable gentleman will be aware that we remain committed to the triple lock. This is a one-year-only bill, and that this will be a continuation of policy that this government has introduced as part of the coalition in 2010 and has continued to pursue on an ongoing basis since there. There is no intention to change that. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to make some progress. Madam Deputy Speaker, it is right that I address the House of Lords amendments because, as you rightfully outlined, they do engage financial privilege because they interfere with the financial arrangements made by the elected House of Commons. That alone, I respectfully submit, is sufficient to disagree with the Lords amendments. However, it is right that I also address directly the respective point that is made by the House of Lords, which invites the Secretary of State to measure earnings as if they were not actually growing by 8.3%. I assure the House that there is no robust way of calculating them as if they were not. The Independent Office for National Statistics has responsibility for producing economic statistics to the highest possible standards. ONS experts investigated whether it was possible to produce a single robust figure for underlying earnings growth that stripped out impacts from the pandemic. They concluded this was not possible. Alongside the actual earnings growth figures, the ONS suggested a possible indicative range of 3.6% to 5.1%. These figures do not have national statistics status. Indeed, the ONS itself includes heavy caveats on this and advises caution in approaching this issue. The Bank of England also cast doubt on identifying a figure that could be relied upon. To quote the ONS itself, there are a number of ways you can try to strip out the base effects, but there is no single method everyone would agree upon. We have tried a couple of simple approaches. Neither approach is perfect. Our calculations of an undying rate are there to help users understand base and compositional effects, but there remains a lot of uncertainty about how best to control for these effects, so they need to be treated with caution. We believe it would be reckless in procedure and in law for this or any other government to set a precedent for uprating benefits or pensions using a methodology which is not robust and for which there is no consensus. That is why the government has decided to suspend the earnings link in this year of exceptional and anomalous earnings growth. Instead, we decided to apply a double lock underpinned by the established CPI, published and approved by the ONS. This approach was also recommended by the Social Market Foundation, other commentators, and very strongly by this House at second reading report and third reading. That is the legislation which this House passed to the Lords, and that is the legislation I would urge this House to send back to the Lords. Madam Deputy Speaker, I remind the House that over the 2 years of the pandemic, the government will have ensured that the pensions covered by this bill will have increased by much more than the increase in prices. That is by reason of the 2.5% increase last year and by the link to CPI this year. And in those circumstances, Madam Deputy Speaker, I would commend this House to reject the House of Lords amendments, and we proceed with this one-year bill by reason of the pandemic, and I beg to move.
Thank you. The question is that this House disagrees with the Lords in their Amendment 1. Jonathan Reynolds.
Madam Deputy Speaker, thank you for calling me to speak on these Lords amendments today. Whatever else could be said about the House of Lords, it is a place that genuinely contains a great deal of expertise on the subject of pensions. We're fortunate to have that expertise in Parliament, and we should be prepared to listen to it. Having studied the exchanges in the Lords, I do feel the government's positions on this matter have not held up well under scrutiny, and the debate has moved on considerably since we last discussed it here. And so, Madam Deputy Speaker, on this side, we will be voting to accept the amendment which was put forward by the former Conservative Pensions Minister Baroness Altman, which was well argued and handsomely carried, but which also most closely reflects our own position on these matters. That is to say that we accept, and I've said so clearly and repeatedly, the government's case that the true figure for earnings growth in the UK is not 8.3%. I think it would be absurd to maintain that is what is happening to our constituents' wages right now. But Labour supports the triple lock, and we believe the government's manifesto commitment should be a binding one, and that the connection to earnings in the uprating decision for this year should remain. In her own remarks, Baroness Altman made clear she was not proposing a specific uprating figure by moving this amendment, and I think that is important. It seems to me that all Conservative MPs could vote for this amendment, honour their own manifesto commitment, and still address the problem of how the pandemic has distorted the earnings data. It would just require the government to effectively make an assessment of whether real wage growth is higher or lower than CPI inflation, and if higher, use that figure. Now, when we last held a debate in the Commons, the government said that would not be legally sound. But I thought the Lords' debate knocked that down fairly easily. As Baroness Altman said, for a judicial review to occur, the figure the government used would have to have been found to have been brought about by the government acting irrationally. Now, that's something we can never rule out with this government, but it should be more than possible to avoid that. If I may say so, Madam Deputy Speaker, I think one of the reasons I believe the government lost this vote badly in the Lords was because of its tendency to rely on short-term, inconsistent arguments to bounce from one day's headlines to another. OK, I'll just wait till I'm on that point.
He criticises the government for not coming up with a solution when he is unable in any way to come up with a solution or a figure himself, as are the ONS, as are the Bank of England, as are all other reputable organisations. In fact, the House of Lords did not come up with a figure. So what, pray, if he would enlighten the House, is the precise figure he would see increased by?
I'm grateful for the honourable member's amendment, and I'm about to explain to him why I think he's got himself and the government into this position. Because time and time again, the Minister just needs to, with respect, listen to this point. He stands at the dispatch box and, like all government ministers, he'll tell us that black is white. So, for instance, Minister, when the government reacted to the crisis of its own making, when we saw the pumps run dry and the shelves go sparse, the government then claimed to the country that this was a secret master plan towards a high-wage economy that it had had all along. And now we're having to see the Minister and the government tie themselves in knots again, because the Minister has been sent here to make the case, we've heard him put it very well, that the figure is too distorted and therefore we need this primary legislation. Yet, and this is the problem, Minister, according to the Prime Minister, wages are actually up. Workers have never had it so good. That's why they can cut £20 a week from universal credit. So, Minister, the government is making two completely opposing arguments. We don't even know if they believe the government, if the government believe wages are actually rising faster than inflation. So I would politely say to the Minister, the government cannot expect to have it both ways. I'd also like to repeat a number of points that colleagues may have heard me say before, but I feel need to be repeated in light of some of the media comments on this bill. The uprating of the state pension is, of course, relevant to millions of pensioners in this country, but it is wrong to present this as an issue of intergenerational fairness. That's because these decisions are also fundamentally about how we make sure the state pension is indexed and retains real value for people who are in work today when they come to retire. And I do believe this government has been grossly unfair on people of working age, but frankly that's due to the burden of taxes it has inflicted upon the workers, rather than through the operation of policies like the triple lock. I also want to say to the Minister that I hope he took on board the comments made about pensioner poverty both in this House and the other place. The government's use of what it calls absolute poverty, but in reality is a measure of poverty relative to a fixed line in 2010, really is, Minister, unsatisfactory. It's unsatisfactory because it ignores the statistical evidence, which is that pensioner poverty is now rising after it fell considerably under Labour, but also that it limits a serious debate about what the drivers of that are. The big picture is that the OBR predict as a country we will be spending an extra £6 billion a year, year on year, on pension age benefits every year up until 2024-25, and that's the year the forecasts in the Welfare Trends report go up to, so it will likely continue to rise after that. So that pensioner poverty is going up as spending rises substantially means we should be having a much more substantive debate about that, looking at housing costs, looking at energy prices, looking at food and access to good financial and investment advice. The way that the government present their own progress means that any real wage growth over the last decade would allow them to claim that poverty has declined. So when the Minister says 200,000 pensioners have been lifted out of poverty since 2010, the reality is that is a very poor level of performance over a decade compared to all previous governments. Poverty is always relative, because it's a measure of whether you have the means to live a fulfilling life in a society of which you are a member. And that's not just a left of centre viewpoint, but one that until recently was accepted by Conservatives too. However, Madam Deputy Speaker, to return to the matter in hand, I believe what the House of Lords have sent us is an amendment which should genuinely command the support of the whole House. It requires the government to maintain the earnings link and their manifesto promise, while still making allowance for the pandemic. The government has dragged politics through the gutter in recent weeks, with stories of sleaze, corruption, contracts for donors, second jobs from Caribbean islands. But I could go on, but the point is this, that public trust in this place matters. And when the government muddies our democracy in the way it has done, it cannot then turn to the public and ask voters to simply take them at their word. For public trust to return, the first step has to be for government to keep its promises. So today Labour is supporting the amendment which would allow the government to do just that and to keep their promise on the pensions triple lock. The Lords have sent us a very reasonable set of measures, and frankly I see no logical reason not to support this amendment if you want to protect the link between earnings and pensions. If the government are unable to do so, then they should admit that is what is really going on. They're using the pandemic as a smokescreen to scrap the triple lock and pocket the savings. What they should do is cut the obfuscation, keep their promises and vote for this set of Lords amendments.
Duncan Baker.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As an MP that is the MP for North Norfolk, with some of the highest numbers of older people in the country, you'd be understand why I want to speak in this debate very briefly. I think, first of all, what we have to do is come back to basics. I was a finance director and a chartered accountant before I came into this place, so statistics are something I have a reasonable grasp of. And I think it's fair to say that this is a government that has, to the tune of around about 400 billion, safeguarded the country through a pandemic that no one ever expected. And not only that, the national debt also sits at some 2.2 trillion. So I think it's absolutely understandable that actually we're sitting here this evening being extremely careful and prudent about what we do with our public finances. The electorate, as we've seen many times before, will forgive a government for many things. They won't forgive a government for being reckless with the public finances. And I think you have to understand that for every 1% increase in pensioners' pay, as much as we'd like to do that, costs the Exchequer £1 billion. Put that into perspective, if we did look at an increase of some 8 to 9%, we're looking at an increase of some 8 to 9 billion pounds. And therefore I can see entirely how would this sit when you have to look at a prison officer in the eye, or a police officer, or a teacher, or any other public service, a firefighter, who has seen their public sector pay frozen for the last year. Okay? I think that is the real context here. It is about fairness, and a statistical anomaly caused by the sort of the dip of coming off furlough onto 100% pay, clearly when the ONS statistics were taken, gives rise to that one-off statistical anomaly. Now, what the House of Lords have proposed was actually sensible, and I took that to the Secretary of State to ask her, indeed, could we do something to still honour the framework of the triple lock, but making sure we had a sensible parameter to measure this by? And the answer that came back was exactly the same answer as the excellent minister in his place gave just before, that you need to have a robust metric. You cannot just move and cherry-pick the goalposts at a point in time because the argument doesn't fit at the moment. So, reluctantly, on behalf of many of my constituents who have written to me about this, and a great number have understood when it's been a detailed reply has gone back to them, do understand why we have had this one-off double lock. But what I would say to the Minister in just summing up is two things. Number one, woe betide if we don't honour the triple lock next year. We have some of the best public finances recovery in the G7, as the Chancellor said the other week. So we must get back to giving our pensioners the pay increases that they absolutely deserve because they have paid in all of their lives. And secondly, it would be wonderful to go into the next election also with the absolute resounding message that our pensions are good, honest pensions that people have earned all their lives, and they go to the level around Europe that people can be really, really proud of, because too many times our pensioners feel that that isn't necessarily the case. So I'd like the Minister to really make sure we put our pensioners at front and centre of the queue as we come out of this pandemic. But I wholly understand what he has said this evening, and I will be rejecting the Lord's amendments because it is sensible to maintain the public purse at a time like this in the best possible way so our country can rebound from where we are at the moment. Thank you.
David Lindham.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow the honourable gentleman from North Norfolk who spoke about the risks of throwing £1 billion about here and there. I know he wasn't in the last Parliament where the government were propped up with the DUP, but I don't recall him having any great difficulty finding £1 billion down the back of the sofa. Indeed, my honourable friend from Strangford, I think, was worth about £100 million, which is probably more than messy. But unlike the Minister, I am glad to see this bill back in the House this evening because the amendments passed by the Lordships now give the Government an opportunity to perform a U-turn with ermine grace and charm. Madam Deputy Speaker, before it went back to the other place, this bill, as originally drafted, facilitated the British Government breaking yet another manifesto commitment, namely breaking the pension triple lock, which I remind the House that all parties in this chamber committed to at the election less than 2 years ago. Now, thankfully, the bill was amended in the other place, and I'm grateful to the noble Baroness Altman for Lord's Amendments 1 and 2, which seek to restore the earnings link. Now, as we are relatively short in time tonight, I will not seek to go over some of the meatier issues that I outlined at second reading, namely the Government's repeated breach of manifesto commitments, the worrying trends in pensioner poverty, pension comparisons with OECD countries, and the, at best, disappointing lack of action when it comes to pre-existing inequalities that are baked into our pension system. But in rising to speak in favour of Lord's Amendments 1 and 2, I want to outline why the SNP will continue to vote, firstly, to respect our 2019 election manifesto commitment, and secondly, why I believe that the budget has changed things which may indeed result in more members on this side of the House voting tonight than perhaps did at second reading. Now, I'm sure that the Minister will have familiarised himself with the House of Lords official report, but in the interest of completeness and for the benefit of Hansard, I want to remind the House what Baroness Altman said in respect to the cost of living crisis, which affects all of those constituents we seek to represent in this House. Baroness Altman reminded the other place that the Government's view was that the original 3.1% figure would still protect against rises in the cost of living. She actually quoted the honourable gentleman, the member for Hexham, when he said that this will ensure that pensioners' spending power is preserved and that they are protected from the higher cost of living. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, the goalposts have moved now and the fiscal outlook is much bleaker, with the Chancellor conceding in the budget that inflation was already running at 3.1% in September and would rise further. The Office of Budget Responsibility have gone further yet, predicting CPI inflation to reach 4.4% next year. And they went on to say that, and I quote, it could hit the highest rate seen in the UK for 3 decades, which this House will know is approximately 7.5%. In reality, the Bank of England's chief economist is actually forecasting 5%. So, to be blunt, the facts have changed and the government must now change its position to at least reflect the fiscal outlook, if not to respect their own manifesto commitment. Madam Deputy Speaker, pensioners across these islands are not immune from rising energy and food costs, and we know that inflation is biting hard for some of the most vulnerable people in our constituencies as we approach what will be a harsh winter. Last month, energy bills rose by 12%. Food bills have risen also, so this government must think again. By scrapping... I'm very happy to give way, my honourable friend.
Honourable Speaker, can I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way? The figure of 12% isn't reflected in Northern Ireland, where the energy prices have risen by some 30%, and the cost of living has also risen by 20%. So, for that reason, the Lord's amendments coming forward are ones that we believe we must support for the pensioners. Does the honourable gentleman agree?
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend from Strangford for that intervention. At the risk of going into talking about energy policy in Northern Ireland, which I would certainly avoid doing given previous actions, I do think he is right, though, to place that on record in his constituents in Strangford. Should be grateful for him, not just for making that point, but also for backing the Lord's amendments tonight when it comes to the division. Now, by scrapping the triple lock, the Red Book suggests that the Treasury will save £5.4 billion in 22-23, £5.8 billion in 23-24 and £6.1 billion in 24-25. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Chancellor is clearly balancing the books on the backs of pensioners who continue to get a raw deal from a pension system that they have paid into their whole lives. And I would caution the Minister that this would be an electorally courageous move for a party which has generally enjoyed higher levels of support among pensioners. Indeed, I will be particularly interested to see how our colleagues from the Scottish Conservatives try to sell this latest broken promise to the electorate north of Coldstream. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, the SNP wholeheartedly opposes the British Government's triple lock betrayal, and we urge the House to support the Lord's amendments before us tonight. In reality, there may be a couple of hundred extra MPs in the division lobbies with us tonight from when the House last looked at this in September, but we know that this Tory government will use its majority to plough ahead and vote down the Lordship's amendments regardless. And my constituents in Glasgow East will once again conclude that this House does not work for pensioners, and it certainly doesn't work for Scotland, and the only way to do things differently is with the normal powers of independence, and in reality, I suspect this Tory bill will only hasten that cause further.
Stephen Timms.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In my intervention to the Minister earlier, I asked him if it remained the Government's intention that the value of the state pension should, over time, at least keep track with earnings. The Minister, in his response, declined to confirm that was the Government's intention. So it may be now that the Government's policy has changed. It's been a long-held policy of governments ever since Adair Turner's pensions report was published in 2006, that the state pension should keep track with earnings, not with prices, not just with prices, as was the case previously. And because the Minister did not confirm that that is still the Government's policy, then I suppose we must conclude that there has been a change of the Government's approach. I'll gladly give way to him, hopefully to clarify the position.
I think he must have misheard me or misunderstood, because this is a one-year bill only. After that, it will revert to the current legislation, and state pensions will increase at least in line with earnings. That is what I thought I made clear at the time.
Well, the Minister did indeed say that in his response to my intervention, but of course that doesn't answer the question. The question was, is it the Government's intention that the value of the state pension should, over time, at least keep track with earnings? And that's what I was hoping that the Minister would be able to reaffirm. I don't think it's controversial. It's been a long-held policy of the Labour government, of the coalition government, and of this government. And I was hoping that he would say that it is still the intention of the current government, even though in the current year, for reasons that we all understand, the value of the state pension is going to fall significantly behind the increase in earnings. And I must say, and I hope I made it clear in my intervention, I think it's entirely reasonable not to increase the level of the state pension by 8% this year. The case for not doing that, I completely understand. It looks as though the increase that we're going to get will be in line with the increase in CPI, so around 3%. But it is very likely on a range of scenarios, and the Honourable gentleman speaking for the SNP talked about what the likely rates of inflation were going to be next year. It's quite likely, depending on the increases in prices and earnings next year, that the state pension will never catch up with earnings in the future, unless there is a catch-up initiative of some kind, and the lines suggested in the amendment from the other place, which we're considering this evening, would provide a mechanism to do that. That will, if there isn't some sort of catch-up at some point, then that will be contrary to the government's long-held intention that the state pension should at least keep track with earnings. And the fact, and the Minister's told the House this twice now, the fact that next year it'll get back in line with the triple lock doesn't solve the problem, because there is this year a significant backwards move. And the question is there going to be some catch-up initiative at some point? And it looks and sounds as though there isn't. Now, keeping the value of the state pension going up in line with earnings was a key pillar of the new pensions framework set out in Adair Turner's report, along with his fellow commissioners, John Hills and Jeannie Drake, when it was published in 2005 and 2006. This recommendation that the level of the state pension should keep track over time with the increase in earnings was, along with auto-enrolment, the key elements of that proposed settlement. It was accepted by the government then and by every government since. And the reason that it's important, I think, does need to be spelt out. This is not just about being more generous to pensioners. It's not just a question of, are we going to be helpful to older people? The reason this is so important is because it makes sure that there is a sound foundation for pension saving, and that people now being auto-enrolled into pension saving through the very successful auto-enrolment initiative that we've all celebrated are not being encouraged by the state into a bad deal. Because if the value of the state pension will not any longer at least keep track over time with earnings, then some people would be better off spending their money now rather than saving into the pension pot which they are being auto-enrolled into. And then later relying on the means-tested safety net of pension credit. Because if the state pension slips behind earnings, then modest pensions accrued through auto-enrolment will become worthless, because those who claim them in due course will not get above the means-tested threshold, and they will still have to depend on pension credit for their income in retirement, and the fact they've saved into a pension will do them no good at all. And that will be a growing problem if the level of the state pension is allowed to slip behind the increase in earnings. If that was to happen, if that does happen, then those people who are looking forward saving but are going to end up with fairly modest pensions should instead have spent the money at the time they earned it, rather than saving it in a pension, which in the end is not going to take them above the means-tested threshold and so is not going to give them any additional income. And that's why what the Minister is arguing for is such a threat to the success of auto-enrolment, because auto-enrolment will no longer be a sound basis for pension saving if the level of the state pension is allowed to drift below the level of earnings. People must be able to trust in the state pension under the policies of the government, and they have been able to up till now, and now they won't. And that does raise a pretty fundamental question about the future of the government's pensions policy. There is a real danger in allowing, almost kind of by sleight of hand, and for reasons that we all understand and sympathise with, that the state pension being allowed to fall permanently behind the increase in earnings, weakening the pension framework, which, as far as we all know, is still the basis for the Minister's policy. We shouldn't allow that to happen. So either what we need is some measure, and the Minister needs to reassure us that there will be some measure, an initiative, a catch-up initiative to make sure that the state pension will, over time, not this year, but by the time we get to next year or the year after, will keep track with the increase in earnings, or the House needs to accept this amendment. The amendment agreed with a significant majority in the other place, because that does keep the pension framework it keeps it in place, and it keeps it effective. And there is, Madam Deputy Speaker, a real worry here that if this significant falling behind, which is, if it is a 3% increase in the state pension at a time when earnings have gone up by 8%, then that will be a one-off 5% fall in the state pension behind the level of earnings. And then, depending on what happens to earnings growth, which is certainly not going to carry on at 8%, and inflation rises next year, then that fall could well be locked in for good, and the pension framework will have been weakened. And I do hope, Madam Deputy Speaker, I've made it clear why this is actually quite an important thing. It isn't just about, are we being generous enough to pensioners? The question is, are we keeping in place a robust and reliable framework, a basis for pension saving on which people can plan with confidence for the future?
John McDonnell.
Yep.
Thank you. Can I just say, on this side of the House, and I think on all sides of the House, we take pride in the Honourable Gentleman's expertise, the Honourable Gentleman from Easttown, because time and time again, as a result of him being the Chair of the Select Committee, he's warned this House on all sides at times about the approach that needs to be taken if we're going to have a stable social security and pensions regime. And I pay tribute to the work that he does. I am an ardent advocate of the coalition government's policy on triple lock, which seems somewhat ironic about the history of this. And I do so because just the historical background of this is that I was a total opponent of Mrs Thatcher's breaking of the link between pensions and earnings. And to be frank, the state pension still hasn't recovered from the breaking of that link. I was elected in 1997. At the end of the Conservative rule in 1997, the basic state pension would have been 50% higher in value if Mrs Thatcher had not broken that earnings link in 1980. And successively in 1997, I prepared alternative budgets to the new Labour budgets. Actually, Gordon Brown had a sense of humour about him and was on a platform with him recently when he said, when I was the Shadow Chancellor, he said, well, actually, he's always been the Shadow Chancellor, because I was producing alternative budgets to him. And in every alternative budget, I put the restoration of the link between earnings and pensions. And I did so because the breaking of that link started to undermine the progress that we'd seen up until then about improving the state pension and lifting pensioners out of poverty. But even That's why I was a strong supporter of the triple lock when the coalition government introduced it. But despite a decade of the triple lock, the basic state pension would still only be 37% higher if the earnings link had been maintained. And that means, I'll just give the figure, this means that today a single pension on the basic state pension would have been £2,662 a year better off, and a pensioner couple would have been £4,277 better off a year if the link hadn't been broken by Mrs. Thatcher all those years ago. And the figures from Age UK now on pensioner poverty is that there are 2.1 million pensioners living in poverty in our country at the moment, and that's up 1.6 million from in 2014. That's a 30% increase. And what's interesting about this is, and not shocking to some in this House, is that the majority of those living in poverty, in pensioner poverty, are women. In addition to that, pensioners from Black and Asian communities are around twice as likely to be living in poverty. And what I find interesting is some of the individual examples we can bring to the House about what that means. I remember when energy prices rose last time in my constituency. I had a constituent who used her bus pass to stay on the bus all day to keep warm. And that wasn't infrequent, those stories about the reasons that people were living in such fuel poverty. And I just remind the House that this year fuel bills are increasing on average £139, and they're expecting to rise again next year. So I just predict we'll have more of our constituents, our pensioner constituents, going cold this winter, and if we're not careful, in future winters as well, especially as has been said, inflation now likely to be 4%, some are even predicting 5%. And I just wondered, what is this row all about? Because I support these amendments. I would have given the 8% because I don't believe that you break the principle of the manifesto commitment in those circumstances. And I believe the additional top-up would have worked. But if we are talking about the Altman Amendment, which is moving towards a 5% increase, the government will award a 3%. So the difference we're talking about, the argument, is about £2.75p a week. Or even if we went to the full amount of the 8%, it would only be an additional £7 a week between the 3% and the 8%. Are we really having a row in this House about robbing pensioners of £2.75p a week? I just find it unbelievable that we can even contemplate that. Can I also say that, look, I've heard that the range of costings that have been made. I just looked at the DWP estimates about the Altman Amendment, and that said it would cost £1.3 billion in 22-23, and that was in comparison with the Uprating with prices. I was in the House a few weeks ago. 1.3 billion we're talking about and arguing about for additional amount of pensioners, when actually there was a 25 billion corporate tax break given away by the Chancellor in a budget, which will be 12.5 billion next year. And I have to say also this issue about calculations, the ONS made it clear their estimate on earnings growth in the 12-month period, May to July, was anything, as the Minister said, anything between 3.6% to 5.1%. And the argument now is that somehow these figures are not robust enough. Can I just say we've had example after example in this House where the government has plucked figures out of the air. And the Minister also said that, in addition to that, there isn't sufficient consensus. Well, if the party opposite agrees, we can build consensus. And you know, when I was in local government, you always, for a rational decision, you always use those Wednesbury principles, that you take into account all relevant factors and dismiss all irrelevant ones. I think if we were coming to a decision tonight in terms of the Wednesbury principles of rational behaviour, it would be on the basis, the choice between arriving at a statistic that is completely agreed by everyone as against leaving pensioners in poverty next year and not being able to afford their energy bills. And can I have to say, it just doesn't cut the mustard, to be honest. The honourable gentleman referred to the calculation when the government wanted to buy off the unionists in Northern Ireland. Figures were just plucked out of the air like that. The level in which pay awards are being imposed at the moment across departments has no rational basis about the work or the productivity of those individual workers. So I think this is a question about whether or not we're in favour of pensioners living in dignity in this coming period, and whether or not we can ensure that they can turn on the heating, whether or not they can have some decent quality of life level, whether or not we can not lift more pensioners out of poverty, but we can prevent more falling into poverty. That's what I think this decision is all about, and that's why I support these amendments. It cannot be right that on the one hand we are cutting taxes to corporations, introducing tax breaks, and yet at the same time preventing pensioners having a basic decent pension. Final point from me is I hear the Minister's reassurances that this is for 1 year only. I've been in this House too long where we've been promised something for 1 year only and suddenly they become permanent, and that's the big fear out there, that actually there'll be another special circumstance next year and then the year after. And as my honourable friend has pointed out, we will lose the commitment that was given a number of years ago that there would be this continuous link with earnings so that the pensioners of this country would share in the wealth more equitably within our country itself. That's why I support these amendments.
This debate has to finish at 6:51. And I intend to bring the Minister in about 6:46. So if the two remaining speakers could be about 6 minutes each, that will fit perfectly. Wendy Chamberlain.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. When we first debated the changes to the triple lock in September, the Secretary of State suggested that we take advice from my friend, the former Pensions Minister, Steve Webb. And the Minister here, and I see the Secretary of State is now in her place, will be happy to know that we do indeed speak from time to time, usually when he is highlighting cases where people have lost out on entitlements due to failures in DWP systems. And as well as holding the DWP portfolio for my party, Madam Deputy Speaker, I am here to serve the interests of my constituents in North East Fife. And I can tell you that I have not received a single email or letter supporting the suspension of the triple lock. What I have received is email after email asking for me to fight to maintain it, pointing out that our state pension is already the lowest in Europe, and from people worrying how they are going to make ends meet this coming winter. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Secretary of State told us at second reading that this suspension was to deal with a one-off anomaly caused by the pandemic. And I do wonder whether she or the Minister have actually engaged with the Prime Minister in advance of second reading about this, because his comments on the subject don't align with that argument. Listening to the Prime Minister has told a very different story, a story where quickly rising wages are not just desirable, but an intended outcome of Brexit. So I do have to ask, whose explanation should Parliament believe on these wage increases? Does the Minister and the Secretary of State align with the Prime Minister now? And if so, why is this government intent on leaving pensioners behind, far too many of whom are already on or below the poverty line? Madam Deputy Speaker, I am happy to support the bill as it is returned to us from the other place. They have worked admirably across their benches there to find this compromise. And the Chair of the Select Committee, in his considered contribution, reminded us that this isn't just about pensioners now, it's about the young. For people who cannot get onto the housing ladder, who see suppressed wages, we need to ensure in this place that decisions we make about pensions now give people that reassurance in the future that there will be a sustainable state pension for people to live in. The bill in its current form acknowledges the distortions to the labour market caused by the pandemic, but also acknowledges that inflation is rising. And under it, pensioners will be able to keep the heat on and afford their weekly shop. Now, I actually want to acknowledge the Honourable Member for North Norfolk for at least trying to justify the Government's position this evening, but I note that no other backbenchers on the Government side have had the appetite to do so. Madam Deputy Speaker, it's a simple choice before the House today. I cannot support the Government's amendments, which will cause such harm to so many.
Patricia Gibson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I rise to speak in support of Lord's Amendments 1 and 2. The Tory government's abandonment of the link between earnings and pension, the smashing of the triple lock manifesto commitment, is truly disgraceful. We are told this is necessary because this year's earnings measure is, and I quote, skewed and distorted. Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, there are many things swirling around Westminster that are skewed and distorted, but the triple lock is not one of them. The UK Government's commitment to the triple lock remains, we've been told today by the Minister. But he will understand that that is not met with widespread scepticism, because today he is here in order to tell us why the breaking of the triple lock must proceed. Now, we in the SNP tabled an amendment to the Social Security Uprating of Benefits Bill requiring the Secretary of State to assess and be held accountable on the impact that this legislation would have on levels of poverty amongst pensioners in each of the devolved nations, which was shamefully voted down by the Tories, and Labour abstained on this, which is something that they will have to justify to pensioners across the UK. Of course, pensioners across the UK and certainly in Scotland have been watching carefully and will not easily forgive this betrayal. This government has not listened to pensioners, and it has not listened to people in this House, members in this House who have defended the triple lock. And I doubt it will listen to the Lords either, but I sincerely hope that the Minister will prove me wrong. There is no doubt that breaking the triple lock we've been told today by the member of North Norfolk that breaking the triple lock would be, and I quote, reckless with taxpayers' money. But I find that actually insulting and wrong-headed, as will many of my constituents in North Ayrshire and Arran, because what we've heard, it shows that this fiscal restraint that we are told is necessary is being balanced on the back of pensioners, such as those in my constituency of North Ayrshire and Arran. And we've heard from the member for Glasgow East about how money can always be found, and we only have to look at the DUP deal to say that. Money can be found when it is considered necessary. Politics is about choices, and choosing to break promises, hard commitments made to pensioners about the triple lock are being broken. And we are watching, and our constituents are watching, and they do not approve. The government tells us that wages are rising, as we've heard, and we know that inflation is rising. So what justification to break the triple lock, to change the goalposts in the middle of the game? And I see that the honourable gentleman wants to come in.
And not only are they breaking their manifesto commitment and reducing and doing away with the triple lock, but already these pensioners, our constituents, are in receipt of the lowest, or one of the lowest state pensions in the whole of Europe. And does she share sort of my confusion that somehow members on the opposite side quite often seem to think that the current state pension, that statistic is an argument for the Union, as if somehow if Scotland was independent it would be even worse?
I absolutely agree with my honourable friend that one of the so-called union dividends is a pension that is a pithy amount when you compare it to other developed nations. There is genuine fear that this abandonment of the triple lock will lead to a more permanent and more damaging actions against pensioner incomes. We know that the state pension is by far the largest source of income for millions of UK pensioners, and the triple lock has kept this secure throughout the pandemic. To break this now, as inflation creeps up, as the cost of living becomes increasingly challenging, is a shocking attack on pensioner incomes, and is part of a wider and increasingly obvious narrative from this government, which is crystal clear. Because we have the evidence. We know that women born in the 1950s had their pension age increased with little or no notice. We have seen unacceptable state pension payment delayed for new retirees, causing genuine financial hardship and suffering. We have more than 2 million older people living in poverty. And with the triple lock abandoned, many pensioners are set to be £520 less well off next year. All of which will do untold damage to pensioners. So today I once again urge the government to stop attacking pensioner incomes and at least keep one of its promises to the electorate and retain the triple lock and prevent more of our pensioners suffering hardship in old age. There is an opportunity today, Madam Deputy Speaker, an opportunity to do the right thing, and the government must take this opportunity, and it must take it with good grace.
Minister Gale.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank all colleagues for their contributions today. The factual reality of the situation, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that this government is spending £129 billion on pensioners. That's £105 billion on the state pension and £24 billion extra on the various add-ons to pensioners, including winter fuel, free eye test, bus passes, free NHS, obviously, pension credit. I could go on in great detail. The Honourable Gentleman for North Norfolk asked whether the triple lock will return. I can assure him that is the case. Yes, of course I will give way.
Just on that point, it's almost as though this is a charitable donation to pensioners. They paid for it, working throughout their lives in their taxes, their national insurance, their contributions. Some of them served on our behalf in armed forces. They paid for this. This is not some charitable donation by the government.
Well, there is so much I could reply to. I could genuinely take some considerable time replying to the Honourable Gentleman, because let us start with some things. So, during the last Labour government, in which the former Pensions Minister and another former Pensions Minister and this gentleman was actually a member, did they in any way link the state pension to earnings? Over 13 years, not on one single occasion. It is this coalition and Conservative government who have linked it to earnings. And he talks about the state pension. That is paid for by the working taxpayer on an ongoing basis. And the working taxpayer is paying more for state pension, and it is a larger state pension than it has ever been before. £129 billion is spent. 129 billion. He doesn't want to hear it because it's the largest state pension, the largest there's ever been at any particular stage. 13 years of a Labour government, and what did they do? They never linked it to earnings. I remember, Madam Deputy Speaker, the 75p increase of state pension by Gordon Brown. It is astonishing, the hubris that he comes up with. The factual reality is that there is never a situation where the Labour government did anything like the coalition and Conservative government did. And I asked the honourable gentleman who represent the opposition to come up for a figure. And you can search hand hard for as long as you like, Madam Deputy Speaker, but answer came there one. There was not a single figure. And the factual reality is that they have no idea how they would approach this. They have not come up with an individual figure, and they are not able to do anything. I will, for the last time, give way to the honourable gentleman.
I'm very grateful to the Minister for giving way, and with a view to trying to bring the heat down just a little bit here. He mentioned a commitment that the triple lock would return next year. Would he be willing to put on record that if the triple lock does not return next year, that he would resign from ministerial office?
It's in the law that this bill only lasts for 1 year. He should really read the Act. It's not that difficult. It only goes to 2 pages and runs to 2 clauses. So No, I won't. I've given way already once to the honourable gentleman. I've answered his point on 2 occasions. So this bill is for 1 year only. After that, it will revert to the current legislation, and state pension will increase at least in line with earnings. The triple lock will, I confirm, be applied in the usual way for the rest of the Parliament. I would point out to the House that last year earnings fell by 1%, Madam Deputy Speaker, but we still legislated to allow state pensions to be increased by 2.5%. And as a result of the triple lock, as I say, the full yearly basic state pension is £875 more than if it had been uprated solely by earnings. £2,050 in cash terms is the increase. Madam Deputy Speaker, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is a bill that is a 2-clause bill that, taken by reason of the pandemic, it will revert to the law lasts only for 1 particular year, and I commend the progress made by this government on this particular issue, and I invite the House to reject the Lord's amendments.
The question is that this House disagrees with the Lords in their Amendment 1. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. Division, clear the lobby.